Week 2 this week, we'll be looking at filtering input and specifically SQL injection attacks. Now, this is part of a broad range of security vulnerabilities where the user needs to be able to enter input into a website or an application. And anytime you have that kind of input process available, there's also the potential for abuse. And this takes many different forms, but in this week, we'll be looking at SQL injection, which is a type of code injection. And this is basically where an attacker uses an input that is expecting a normal value like name or address, and the hacker is able to supply some code that gets executed by an underlying process, like the browser, or in this case, the database. Now, you might not be familiar with SQL, which is standard query language. It's the native language of most relational databases. So when you are reading or updating data in a database, you probably use SQL, and lots of applications use SQL to communicate with the database, either to query data or update rows in the database. Now, you might not be familiar with SQL, so there are a few basics that you'll need to understand, and we have some links here on the lab page that you can use to kind of get the kind of knowledge that you need to proceed with this. But you don't need to be an expert with SQL. In fact, you don't even really need to be proficient with SQL. So if this is your first time seeing SQL or your first real exposure to it, don't let that stop you. This will be the first of many topics that this course is going to introduce you to that you will probably not have a lot of knowledge about. And the more knowledge you do have about it, obviously, the better it will be. But we are really looking to build this skill of encountering some of these very complex domains without a lot of context and just understanding how they can be manipulated. So get up to date with SQL a little bit by reading some of these links. You especially want to be familiar with the basic types of statements: select, insert, update, and delete. And then clauses, the way that the SQL statements are structured and the syntax that they use, and operators such as and and or. But you don't really need to spend a lot of time getting up to date. One of the things that you really need to understand about SQL injection attacks is that these inputs in a web page, such as something that allows you to enter your name into a guest book, is bound usually to a SQL statement on the back end. So the app takes the input that you enter into a field and it plugs it into a SQL statement that it then issues to a database. Here we have a select field from table where field equals condition. And you can see everything in the box here is an example of something that might be injected. So you have to imagine maybe the page that is seen by the user is a search page that lets you enter a name to search for. And when the user enters a name, it gets plugged into the select statement in between these single quotes, and the database will return all the rows that matches the field equaling that name. In a vulnerable situation, the attacker might, instead of supplying a name, supply a string like this, anything, close the quote, and then add some SQL. You see there's an or clause here, and then another condition that kind of seamlessly gets inserted into the SQL statement. But the thing to realize is this isn't treated as a literal value completely. Everything outside the quotes is actually interpreted directly by the database. So in this case, a simple query like this, it might be driving a search page and allowing a user to search for records matching a specific name. The attacker could supply something like this, which would return all the rows. In this case, you can see that X will always equal X, and so this condition will always evaluate to true. And so the select will return every row in this table, which might be a really bad thing if that includes data that we would not want someone to be able to see. So we're going to go through these SQL injection tasks one by one. You won't need anything for this lab except the browser. So the kind of cool thing here is that it's just you and the browser in these little HTML inputs, and you are trying to find ways to break them. Part of the mentality here is to imagine what the SQL statement probably looks like. And then part of the mentality is really trial and error. You're going through different variations of very similar kinds of things to find something that works, to find something that breaks the page in a way that gives you enough information to maybe break it in a way that gives you valuable information. So go through the SQL injection challenges one by one. And in some cases, we have saved the optional challenges for last. Now, there are a few of these, so you can do as many of them as you have time for. Definitely go through the first 3 or 4 first and make sure that you can do those, and then move on to the bonus ones after that. And these bonus ones are more difficult, they will take more time, but remember, a lot of this really boils down to trial and error, trying different specific combination of known hacks that can be used to break a SQL statement. And by break, I mean basically get the database to execute your SQL instead of the SQL that the developer wrote. And so this is a really kind of tricky mindset to get into, where you have only an input and you have to supply something that the database would recognize as executable code. But this is a pattern we'll see over and over again in the course of providing code that actually gets executed when it shouldn't be. And on the defensive end, the developer needs to make sure that any value coming in from an input on a page is filtered or sanitized in a way that prevents this attack from happening. But there are many different variations of this attack, and so there are many different ways to break a database or break a page this way. In fact, an improperly protected form like this, all it would take is one input to possibly exfiltrate the entire database. So SQL injection can be a really, really powerful technique, and can be a technique for gaining even more robust access to a site. So it's worth spending some time here. It will be a little bit frustrating, but I think you'll get the hang of it. And just remember, trial and error, and be persistent and get as much as you can done. Good luck.